in real life.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Who was a bird?
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I know a lot of persons are still coming in, um, but we are live, myself and Mr. Jairo Rodriguez and Mr. Christopher Belfield, and we are here to talk to you about sexual offenses. Um, Jairo, you can introduce yourself to the people, say a bit about yourself. I know I could have done it, but I'll give you that opportunity to be you.
Oh gosh. Well, hello everyone. My name, well, as introduced, Jairo Rodriguez. I am a human rights coordinator, basically, an advocate that specializes in sexual and reproductive health and rights and related programs with women empowerment, LGBT rights, and of course, gender relations and equality.
Ah, awesome. Chris? Is he here with us?
He's loading.
Loading. Okay, so we're having some technical difficulties with Chris this afternoon.
I thought
Okay.
I've been hanging, you know,
He's definitely experiencing some technical difficulties. So, Jaro, you want to go straight into your presentation? Um, and then we'll probably get back to Chris a bit later when his Wi-Fi is cooperating. Jaro, we can go ahead with you and get back to Chris because I am not sure what's going on with his Wi-Fi.
All right. So we are particularly in an environment where domestic violence and gender-based violence will be heightened because we're all at home, we're all in spaces where we are. It's going to be tense. It's going to be tense. You're
Right.
going to have anxiety that's going on. People are frustrated. You also have to realize that people are losing their jobs. But these aren't excuses. And something to look at is children and women are stuck at home with perpetrators of violence. And similarly, so men and children are stuck at home with perpetrators of violence. So in that case, I'm happy that, well, the Bishop's High School Law Society found a need that we would be able to discuss sexual offenses, particularly that we had a sort of a social media awareness campaign that happened
Right.
a few days ago. And it's very important because looking at in the Guyanese society, 3 years ago, sexual abuse is actually found to be the number one form of violence perpetrated against children in Guyana. And that was shocking, considering that it wasn't physical violence, because beating kids, it's sort of a Guyanese culture. It wasn't verbal abuse, because we yell at kids all the time. It was sexual abuse. And many times we need to discuss and look at why do we really have a culture that it's so, sex is so taboo. Like we don't even talk about sex. We don't talk about sexual rights. We don't talk about law. We hush it up. Yet the rate of violence of sex is just skyrocketing statistics. And even the things that offset it, like adolescent pregnancy, which we have the second highest rate in Latin America and the Caribbean. And considering too that all of these things tie in with sexual offenses, and we should discuss sexual offenses. I prepared a presentation to at least guide the conversation on it, because before we look at sexual offenses, we should at least think about sexual rights. What are sexual rights? Um, I can't really see comments or anything right now on this platform. Nia, would you be able
Right. I'll
to?
I'll be able to actually put it on the screen so we can both see it. So if
Great.
anybody has any questions in between, we'll get to addressing it.
All right. So this discussion is very heavy because it deals with a lot of persons who would have been victims, a lot of survivors of sexual assault. So it does come with a sense of sensitivity, especially with comments. People should be sensitive that we all have different experiences and we shouldn't reject,
Yeah.
deny these experiences. Everyone has some sort of, and something I like to ask, particularly young men, it's just have a conversation with their colleagues, their peers, and how many times they felt uncomfortable in a room because someone was staring at them or someone made an approach. You have to be mindful that these things can be
Right.
triggered. They can be triggers and it can make people feel very uncomfortable, even though we're having a safe and healthy discussion on them. And with that comes the second thing I want us to be mindful of is respect. Respect everyone's opinions. You might not agree with it. You might not even agree with things I'm going to be saying. You just need to respect that, particularly for me. This is my job. I'm a professional at the way that I handle sexual rights, sexual and reproductive rights. So it's not as if I'm talking opinion. These are actual laws that I want to talk about. And things I need to be mindful to the language I use. For example, many times you're going to hear me talking when if I use cases, it's going to be seen as though men are always the perpetrators of violence. And that is not so. Men are not always the perpetrators of violence. Women can also perpetrate violence, even children. But statistically, men are up there because of the power dynamics of gender. Um, and just really because of the amount of power society gives men. Most
True. That is so
they
true.
are a majority. And that's what we gotta go into looking at now. Sexual rights. What are sexual rights? Now, everyone has sexual rights. It's a component of human rights. If you're human, you're sexual. If you're sexual, you have certain rights that will dictate your life and your sexuality. One of those things that all individuals have the right free of violence, coercion, and discrimination of any kind when it comes to their sexuality and their sexual life. Everyone has the right to pursue a satisfying, safe, and pleasurable sexual life. And that ties into sexuality education, and that also ties into sexual health, and also being comfortable with what you do in your sexual life. Because sexuality is diverse, and sexual pleasure too is diverse. What you may like, someone else may not like. It needs to be respected, and something that we must always remember is consent. Now, because sexual rights exist, there are people who are going to want to abuse or violate those sexual rights.
Right.
And in a general sense, sexual abuse is any sort of non consensual sexual contact. And this can happen to both men and women at any age at all. People, their sexual sexual rights can be violated even if they're not sexually active. So children are not sexually active, for example, but children can have their sexual rights violated. Because as I say, it's a human right, and it all goes into you have a right over your own body. No one else has that right. You have the right to decide, you have the right to choose what you want to do, and you have certain freedoms and rights that you can express. Sexual abuse. Now, it's always a heavy topic, but just to know it's any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act by violence or coercion. And it even goes into acts of trafficking. Human trafficking would be considered sexual abuse because we like to sometimes laugh about the Venezuelan migrants, the Cubans, and the sexy Latina girls. But you need to understand what puts them in that situation. Many times, they are victims of human rights trafficking, and they're basically
True.
brought to perform sex work. And
And so
oftentimes,
many persons, like, they don't even know the seriousness of the situation because you just see them here and you assume they're here just because they want to be. But so
mhm.
many of them are forced to be here, either like literally forced or situationally forced. And it's really sad that so many persons just, assume based on their own common knowledge. But it's really deeper than that a lot of times.
Many times they're tricked into coming, and when they're tricked to come say, okay, we're going to give you some other work, like you're going to work at a hotel, persons will take away their passports and they're essentially trapped in Guyana. And then how else are you going to eat? How are you going to find lodging? How are you going to
Right.
be guaranteed safety? They're forced to perform sexual acts, which include strip clubs. Just note that there are many factors that contribute to the prevalence of sexual abuse. And I mentioned earlier about the power dynamics between the gender and the sort of power society would give to certain genders. And we know this to be a fact. If you go to a police station and as a man to report assault or rape, sexual assault or rape, society being acted by the police will laugh at that man. And many times if you're a woman was to say, I have been assaulted, I have been raped. Society again comes in and laughs at that woman and say, you're a liar, you were looking for it, you're a slut. And the victim blame her. They say somewhere or the other this was your fault. So society contributes to that inequality of power between the genders, which really is a major contributing factor of why people commit sexual offenses, particularly adults against children, because they tell children, shh, no one's going to believe you, or don't do this, or else you're going to get
Right.
in
That
trouble
is
too.
so true.
Because you give a power to the adults and parents over children. So obviously, it creates a sort of nasty environment where you almost make it seem as if sexual offenses they're okay, and it's not. Um, it's sexual abuse is most dominant when persons are vulnerable or perceived to be vulnerable. So if you are working in an office, um, and you're the boss man or the boss lady, obviously you're higher paid, and you are basically the decision maker of what power or promotion a person can get. So because you perceive
Right.
them to be vulnerable, you use that. And it happens in schools also. A teacher has certain powers over the students. For example, grades. If you want a B or a better grade, you will do certain acts. It happens all the time, all the time. And the vulnerability of those communities just make them more susceptible, particularly when we look at trans women. This again, we like to make a lot of jokes about, but women, trans women on the streets, the cathedral, who basically do sex work. You have to ask, why are they doing sex work? Why are they in that position? Is there something
Right.
wrong with society? Is there something wrong with inequalities and powers? Yes. And unfortunately, we only get the videos when we see trans women are abusing or cursing out clients who did not pay them. And we share it on Facebook and we laugh about it. But that in itself is an abuse of sex. You use someone for sex and you abuse them. You don't pay them because sex work actually is work. It's one of the world's oldest professions. Um, and you basically violate them and the terms and any agreements, and then you shame them and
But
it's
is that
all
actually
wrong.
legal here though?
And I want us to look at particularly lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans persons are a vulnerable community. And that's my chicken, Ben, don't mind him. And many times what we'd see is that persons would correctively rape LGBT persons because they think that their sexuality is wrong, it's unnatural, it's deviant. So in order for us to correct it, we will have to have sex with you without your consent. That also is real and happens in Guyana. I'm gonna break if anyone has any questions or anything on that.
Um, I'm not really seeing anybody asking any questions. I actually have Chris on the phone here because we weren't getting him through the platform that we're using. So, Chris, do you have any comments?
Not right now at this moment. I've been listening to what Jairo is saying, and I absolutely agree with everything that he's saying. You know, how we navigate sexual rights and the abuse of persons and sexual abuse of persons is largely impacted by society and how society would navigate how society is created, how we should look at these things and examine them indeed. So I definitely agree with what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. And I guess as we go along, we spoke about person being in position of power, position of influence, which also influences decisions that we make when we're under their authority. And as we go along and we start to think where it speaks about persons who are in a position of trust and using that position and trust. It's all there in the Sexual Offences Act, so it's definitely something that the law anticipates and that we have laws in
Yeah.
place for.
All right.
All right. Nia, go ahead.
Um, Okay, so I don't see any questions here in the comments. Persons seem to be listening to everything that we have to say and taking in. They're in agreement. Persons are saying so true and facts and stuff like that. So I think we can continue with the presentation, and as things move along, if anybody else asks anything, I'll highlight it.
All right.
So, oh, wait, we have a question that just came in from Miss Sills. She's asking if prostitution is legal in Guyana. She's saying it's not to justify the abuse, but she's just curious as to how that affects the rights or protection for these persons. So, Chris or Gyro?
Hello? Nia?
Yeah, Gyro.
Okay, I was just gonna switch my networks because I think I was lagging for a second there. It probably
Yeah.
dropped. So is prostitution legal in Guyana? Not saying it justifies the abuse, but curious. I actually love this question because uh the laws that govern prostitution were written almost 130 years ago. We were still a British colony, and they
Wow.
did not make prostitution itself illegal. What is illegal is owning a brothel or operating a brothel. So basically, you can have sex with some sort of an agreement. This is my understanding of it, mind you. So you could basically have sex with some sort of agreement if you want, but you cannot spend the money that you would have made through sex work, and you're not allowed to operate in anywhere to do sex work. So they're not making the sex work
Interesting.
illegal, they're making everything around it illegal. And it's the same thing for same-sex intimacy in Guyana or homosexuality. It is not illegal to be gay or lesbian, it's illegal to perform gay sexual acts. So the laws back then were written in such a way to we don't want to discriminate against sex work or LGBT persons, but we're just going to discriminate against the things they do.
Oh,
So
wow.
Right.
that's one of the laws. So,
Just a
and
portion
even
of
if
that,
sex work
that
is,
the Act in 1893, it actually did make owning what we refer to as a common body house illegal, which we would refer to as a prostitute house or whatever the case may be. And they told us that anyone who engages or engages in any common nuisance that endangers the life, safety, or health of the public, or which injures the person of an individual shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to 2 years imprisonment. They go on to say anyone who keeps or manages a common body house or anyone who keeps or manages a common field, covered, or disorderly house shall be guilty. Like Jared says, there isn't any explicit law that says prostitution is illegal, but there are laws that surround the culture of prostitution that would make its operation difficult to navigate when it comes to the law or the law
Right.
that determine legal.
And that happens a lot with any laws relating to things that link the law with morality. I've noticed from our acts and constitution itself, anything related that links the law to anything that is immoral, they tend not to make the thing in itself illegal, but all the acts that surround it.
Now, what you see is that as society evolves, remember morality, law, and society is ever changing, and what the legal responsibility that we have, or the responsibility the governments have, to ensuring that as society progresses, as morality changes and shifts, as things become more acceptable and they become a new normal, that the laws are there to support this societal shift, because you can't have a progressive society where practices are in place and certain things are accepted and the law isn't there.
yeah. And that was actually the groundbreaking judgment that the Caribbean Court of Justice had made concerning the legal challenge of cross dressing. And they were like,
Right,
society, well, basically, law is reflective of society, and society is not it's very dynamic, it's ever changing, and law should always be updated to change and reflect society. So it all goes back to us, we having outdated laws and we needing to update them. And about that, um, I'm so happy to say that one such act is the Guyana Sexual Offences Act. It was first passed in 2010, and they updated it, I think, in 2013. And it's considered one of the most, and I keep saying it's one of the most progressive pieces of legislation we have in the
right.
region. And at one point, even as far as many European countries, because while some countries still and back then had laws that did not recognize that men can be raped, Guyana Sexual Offences Act recognized that men can be raped and that anyone basically can be a victim of sexual offenses. Um, so some key terms to recognize in the act. I want you to look at basically a child, anyone under the age of 18 years. Consent. And I touched on that in the introduction, and I want to just go over it again. Words are express action by a person who is competent to give informed consent. And why is it competent to give informed consent? Is that you need to realize that not everyone can give consent, particularly
Right.
if you're under the age of consent. So realize there that a child is a person under the age of 18, yet the age of consent is 16. So you have 2 years where, as a child, you are given the legal right to say yes or no to sex. But under that age, under the age of 16, you cannot.
Um,
And that needs to be clearly understood. And something that comes into the discussion with this is that also recognize that if someone is 17 years old, and you being a common example would be a bus conductor, although this girl is 17 years old and you are 25 or somewhere along that line, that still does not give you a moral right or even a social right to have sex. Because at the end of the day, that girl is a girl. She's under the age of 18. So even though she can consent, I think a lot of men particularly need to be responsible with their actions. Yeah,
A few, Jairo, you finished? Sorry.
go on.
Yeah, I wanted to add a few pointers as it relates to the law concerning what Jairo just said. Now, I wanted to now section 5 of Criminal Law Offences Act tells us that um, consent and a belief in consent cannot be inferred if there is lack of a physical resistance on part of the complainant, or if there's the reason for sexual arousal includes an orgasm or ejaculation. So somebody not physically reacting or physically being resistant to you having sexual intercourse with them does not mean that consent is inferred. However, the law does actually provide for instances where the complainant actually believed that he had gotten consent from the behavior of the victim. And that is addressed in section 6, 7, and I believe it's also addressed in section 8. Now, section 6 tells us that where a where an accused believes that he has consent, it must be to an objective standard. It must be to the standard of the reasonable person, the reasonable prudent man or woman, and in considering we must also consider the circumstances in which it happens. So if I can go to the app quickly and give you verbatim what it says, in section 6 it says, when a defense of belief and consent is raised to the offense of rape or sexual assault, the belief must be objectively reasonable. And what does objectively reasonable mean? It means that the average man walking around must have the same standard of belief, right?
Right.
And they go on to tell us that whether a belief is reasonable is to be determined by having regards of all the circumstances, including any steps the accused has taken to ascertain whether the complainant or the third person would have consented, right? They go on to tell us that it is not a defense to a charge of rape that the accused reasonably believe that the complainant consented to the sexual activity that forms the subject matter of the charge, where there was self-induced intoxication, or where the accused did not take reasonable steps in a certain consent. So I think that's oversight when we get into the discussion about sexual offences in Guyana. Because we're usually told that if there's not an explicit physical or verbal consent, then there is no consent. But the law, as it does in every jurisdiction, makes way for a person to reasonably believe or the objective standard that consent was given. But of course, like I said, all the circumstances have to be considered in making such a determination and going with it.
All right. So on consent. So thanks, Chris. Penetration.
Um, aside
Hmm.
from the whole age thing,
Uh-huh.
what other exceptions are there when it comes to consent? Who cannot give consent? Because I know a lot of persons they talk about um being drunk
Uh-huh.
and giving consent and stuff like this. So what excludes you from being capable of giving consent?
All right. So, Jairo, can I go off on that a bit?
Um,
Or you
being
want to go
mentally.
first?
Hmm? Just what
No,
I
go ahead.
know, and I'm going to touch on it in the Sexual Offences Act. It's being mentally ill. That's one. And being in a state of intoxication.
Okay,
Also,
so being a child, being mentally ill, and being in a state of intoxication.
yeah, there is what I'm gonna have to read that more. I do believe too that I mean, if you're in a trust, if here's what can get you in trouble. It's not really a consent thing, but it can still get you in trouble. So if you're taking care of like an elderly person or someone with a disability, you're in a position of trust. So the law there, Chris would be able. I don't know if Chris would be able to help me here.
So,
So yeah.
Yeah,
let
go
me
ahead,
let,
Chris.
let me add to that. So, the law as it relates to consent tells us that if you're not of age, cannot give consent. That's one. If you are not of mental capacity, you cannot give consent. That's two.
Can I?
In case,
Okay, continue and I'll go back to that part.
right, right. If your ability, if your thinking ability would have been altered due to some drug, alcohol, or some other circumstances, then you cannot give consent. However, the law, the Sexual Offences Act actually has a few offences where it appears that you will be strictly liable, and they call them the non-consent offences. And like Jairo rightfully said just now, those situations arise when you're in a position of trust, when you are in a position of caring for a vulnerable adult, or whether
Mhm.
you're in a position of similar nature. So those offenses are covered from, I believe it's section 9 all the way to section, they go down all the way to somewhere around section 16, 15. They look at things like voyeurism. They also look at having sex with family members. Those
Right.
offenses are non-consent offenses where you cannot give consent to your brother to have sex with you under the law. The law does not recognize that. So those are all circumstances in which consent cannot be given. It's not recognized by law. Period. There's no going around that.
All right. We actually have a question here from someone. They're asking what exactly being mentally ill entails.
Right. That's a great question. Let me see if I can give me a second and let me see if I can get the definition that the law would have set out for us. Shall
So
I
I
be
saw that question actually, Chris, and I'm actually going through the act right now. And from my initial reading, the act never really defined sexual mental, like they didn't spell it mentally ill, because someone who, for
right?
example, they can give consent, but they're bipolar. They're very rational, but they still have a mental illness. Does that mean they can't give consent? Things like that. So, Chris, yeah, I would love if you can just review, and because this question always comes up, and I really don't know how to answer it.
um, an extension to that is this comment where the person is saying that they know that being mentally ill means that you can't give consent, but does that mean that you cannot have sex then as a mentally ill person? Ah, I mean, essentially, I'd like to believe so. If you are mentally ill, you cannot give consent. So technically, it's illegal for anybody to have sex with you simply because you're mentally ill.
Right. So, like Jared, careful, like Jared would have said, the act doesn't spell out what mentally ill
Oh,
is. Um,
I found it.
in section 26, they address the fact of key workers causing a person to mentally disorder to have to watch a sexual pregnancy. But I have come across an explicit definition of mental illness in my reading. Um, what I can suggest or see though is that in determining if somebody is mentally ill to the extent that they can give, because we're all mentally ill in some form. People might suffer from depression, people might suffer from PTSD, and those are all considered mental illness. I think how we view mental illness would have been evolving as we would have progressed as a society, as we would have added more literature to what mental illness is and what it encompasses.
Right.
Traditionally, we think you're mentally ill and you're just a crazy person and you're just out of the world. But today we don't recognize mental illness as that. We recognize mental illness as suffering from depression, suffering from loneliness, and all sorts of things. So I think in determining and in channeling the spirit of the Sexual Offences Act as it relates to mental illness, we consider the circumstances and we consider the objective standard. If a person is medicated for depression, they feel and they're we see them as being mentally ill because they're suffering from a disease of the mind and they're on medication and they're doing fine. Who's the law to say that they can't give consent? we don't take away the ability to give consent in those cases. But if it is where somebody is so mentally altered that they are unable to be reasonable, to give reasonable consideration to circumstances, to make decisions for themselves, then we definitely would acknowledge that as mental illness to the extent where they cannot give consent.
Interesting.
All right.
Am I making
Just to
sense?
know that I found this specific part in the act that defines mental. It says mental disorder, meaning any
Right.
disorder, disability of the mind, including learning disability.
Oh, wow.
So again, a bit. It didn't really go into detail, but just to be on the same side, if someone has a mental disorder, they do not have the right to give consent.
Okay. For
Um,
persons that would have further reading, I'll be sure to post the act itself on the Law Society page because I know a lot of persons will have many questions that we may not answer due to time constraints, but we'll be sure to post the act so that you can be able to access it. It is online, but just to have the material there for anybody that may not be able to find it, we'll post it. Gyro, you can continue.
all right. Where was I? Oh, so penetration. So that is one of the upgraded progressive definitions that we have in the Sexual Offences Act. Penetration is defined as any intrusion, however slight and for however short a time, of any part of a person's body or of any object into the vagina, mouth, or anus of another person. It is also the act of placing the mouth of one person and the genitals of another. If you realize, well, oh, let me put that up again. Um, oh, it's going up and down. So with that, penetration there, if you realize there's no assumption of gender, it doesn't assume that only a penis of a man could go into the vagina of a woman. It extended it, broadened the scope to understand that any object or any part of a body that goes
Right.
into the orifice of another person's body. And in order to protect men, it also considers, and this is, I love to use societal examples, yeah? Because when I do these sessions, a lot of people would come, they talk in the group sessions, they talk asking questions. And one of the questions that come up would be every morning that, but basically every morning my man he's wake up hard. So I would perform oral sex on him. Is that rape? And I'm like, did the man give you prior consent to say that this is okay? And the some women would respond, no. In that case, yes, it is rape because you didn't get consent to perform fellatio on the man. And that is considered rape because it's a body or is an object going into another part, well, your body. And this goes to the
Interesting.
whole conversation of marital rape. We're going to touch on that later, but it is quite, and this needs to be reiterated, that you can have or perform sexual offenses on your partner. Again, it comes back to that word we spent a lot of time on, consent.
Right.
Now, so in saying
Um, okay, Chris, sorry.
what I said, so this is what happens. The general, the general approach, as it relates to having sex without, the example that Jared gave, that's the general approach. What we see in case law, and when it comes to defenses of sexual of accusations of sexual misconduct,
Right.
case law shows us that if it is that a couple or if it is that two persons perform traditionally in a specific manner or they communicate in a specific manner, then it can be adduced that consent was given. Now, these circumstances are very rare and they're carefully examined because the law is explicit when it comes to how we engage sexually and giving consent. So let me use Jared's same example to show how somebody trying to establish defense presents it to a jury. So if it is that every morning, um, you wake up next to your husband and he gets hard, or there's some sort of implicit communication where he wakes up and looks you in the eye and he gives you like a double wink, a double left eye wink, right?
Yeah.
And during your marriage, you would have established that when you wake up and you give me that double left eye wink, it means that I want you to perform fellatio on me and I want you to have sex. I don't need to say I want to have sex, but that's what it means. And if it is that morning, um, he wakes up and he gives the double eye wink, but he just doesn't feel that she wants to perform oral sex today, and he just decides to get to put his teeth into her nose. Um, then the issue of the heedless consent comes about, and in a defense, the issue of them performing in a traditional manner, the way they acted on that specific day in those circumstances, is it recognized as how they normally act and how consent is usually given in that relationship? So it's a very, very tricky, it's a very, very tricky thing. The circumstances are very tricky to navigate around. The law is always explicit, like the layman would always like to say the law has loopholes. And once again, that comes about because circumstances are always different, and the law seeks to be just. The law seeks to administer justice, and it looks at things like this and it considers things like this. And as we all know, where we have a common law English jurisdiction, we also use and as law arising from statute. So there are a few case law cases. I didn't remember LOV, and I probably read one or two for Keith, where during a defense or to establish a defense, the issue of how we can be raised.
Hello.
I think that's something that we should we should all familiarize ourselves with as we progress and as we endeavor or as we engage in the studies of sexual behavior and as it relates to the law.
Somebody in the comments is asking a question based on the scenario. What Mr. Boston wants to know is that, given the scenario, if he allows her to do it after she has started, would that still be constituted as rape?
Come again. Let me try to find the comments. Read it again to me, though.
Essentially, if he allows her to continue, would it still be constituted as rape? Would it still be rape?
If he allows her to continue?
Yeah, she has started without his consent, but he allows her to continue.
Again, it all comes back to the particular circumstances and the manner in which these persons would engage or behave when it comes to their sexual behavior. If it is that, like I said, if it's every morning that he gives her this point and they know what that means, then we could ascertain or we could assume that consent is given. But as we know, consent can be withdrawn at any moment during sexual intercourse, and that consent can be taken away. So again, it's not black and white. It comes down to examining the specific circumstances and specific facts of the matter. If it is sort of indicated something during his manner of behavior or verbally or body language to indicate that he's not willing to engage, then obviously we can say that withdrawn his consent rather. So it all comes down to the circumstances and the facts of each case in itself.
There is where I want to interject. I know you're saying that consent is not always black and white, but the thing is it should be, because silence is not consent. Lack of action is not consent. Misreading body movements and body language is not consent. In that situation, if he allows her to do it. Now, what I'm looking at is if he allows her. So he's not objecting. If he's not objecting, if he didn't say no, if he didn't push her off, if he didn't recline, then in that way, he should clearly indicate that, yes, I would like you to do this or continue, which means it would be legal. But if he's not saying anything and she continues, he can report it as rape. Legally, he can, because he didn't say to do it. He didn't verbally express consent, and he just did nothing. And doing nothing, the onus is on the other person to say, okay, my partner is not responding to this, so should I go ahead? Should I do it? Essentially, it's the same thing of having sex with a with someone who is in a coma. You can't have sex with someone because they're not moving, they're not saying anything, they're not doing anything, so you can't. So
Right.
I know you're
And
saying
added
it
to
is
that, even if they orgasm or ejaculate after,
Right.
it's still not constituted as consent because
Correct.
they
you
didn't
need
explicitly say yes.
good. So I know you're saying, Chris, that it's not sometimes it's all in a court. All these things happen sometimes with the judgment of the court. But we're saying that it shouldn't be black and white, but it should. Consent should always be clear. As long as consent is not clear, don't do it. Don't.
Right.
I will repeat that. As long as consent is not clear, step back, move away. Do not do anything. Get that clarity. It's a yes or a no.
Right.
Yeah. Um,
So,
I
in
wanted.
commenting, sorry, go ahead.
Chris, you want to continue?
Right. So, in commenting on what Jared said, I think it's always, like you said, consent should be black and white. That is not how it is in practice, sadly. I think it's always important. It's extremely important for individuals to always be sure. I don't care how much of a punk you have to be if you gotta stop in the middle of the interaction and ask. I think um it's always important that you are sure of the fact that consent has been given to you to engage in a sexual manner. But on the alternative, we have cases where we watch movies all the time how we see this happen in society. Where a girl and a guy is right?
Right.
And they act in a particular manner, or the guy acts in a particular manner, and the other party, they might receive those signals, but they might be confused about those signals. So therefore, they don't act on it. Now, when I go home in a group chat, I go home and tell my friends that you could imagine I went out with A and I did doing all of this and A didn't do nothing. Like, A so lame and A so this and A so that, right? And in how we practice or how society practices navigating sexual activity is far way more complex than I feel we could ever put down on paper in black and white. And that's what makes these circumstances extremely difficult. It becomes extremely difficult. And um, I feel that that's the challenge we have when it comes to us saying that, consent should be black and white. And if it's not black and white, then it's not that. It should be. But in how we practice in society, in our everyday life, it's definitely not the case. But like I said again,
Hello.
and when I was studying law and cases presented to us, there are couples who usually like to role play, right? And I remember I had this lecturer, this guy, she was saying that in an instance where a couple foreplays and when the girl says no, she actually means yes or she wants to progress to another level. How do we navigate circumstances like that where people operate in a particular manner and because of how they usually operate, we usually think that consent is there. But then at some point, it could be that that is not the case, where that consent is withdrawn and we're not even aware of it because of how we usually operate in these circumstances. So it's very complex. It's very frustrating. The law is clear, but our practices aren't. Our societal practices aren't. I don't know if I'm making sense to you, Jared. If you understand what I'm saying.
I do, but I'm going to jump in to say because I have personal experiences with this, and that is why people you should discuss with your sexual partner what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do, and if um I like to foreplay, and before foreplay, you need to communicate that this is what we're going to do, and this is the safe word. Safe word because sometimes you're going to say no, right? No, but sometimes it's a playful no. But a safe word would make sure that with consent is being withdrawn, I don't want to move forward. So it's not to say that you gotta assume couples are going to get this. Couples should communicate this before having sex.
Right.
There's a video that GRPA produced about that, what really is consent and what is pleasure. And although we don't do this in Guyana, at least in my experience, we should. We should communicate to say, this is what we're going to do. Is this okay? Can I do this? It can be before sex, and it can also be during sex when you're like, can I go ahead? Should I go ahead? Does this feel okay for you? Do you want me to stop? Etc. Like, you should always communicate. So, and I think by the time you reach into a courtroom, all of that is going to be discussed. Like, you can't say, oh, she had wanted it because she seemed to orgasms, and this goes back to something I saw in the comments. Being aroused or ejaculating or having an orgasm, or even certain songs that you'd make during sex, isn't consent. So we can't assume that because they're a couple, this is okay. It should be communicated every step of the way. That's what I want to jump into to say about that scenario.
Okay, awesome. So, I think we can move on from consent. Uh,
All right. Um, Everybody know I did mention early in the presentation that some years ago, Ghana recorded that sexual abuse is the number one form of violence against children. And to understand that, it's simple as the things you say. For example, older boys who make girls undress and then fondle them. It's children by adults or by older children or even peers, because many times in the classrooms in our schools, again, I'm going to use societal examples. In the classrooms of schools, boys would touch their peers, their colleagues, their classmates inappropriately on their breasts, on their butts. Those things are considered sexual abuse, and it happens quite often. It can be committed by strangers, but more than often, it's perpetrated by adults or older children that they're in a trusting or a caretaker role. So
right.
babysitters, uncles, family friends. That's the majority of how child sexual abuse happens. It's to know that if you penetrate, and again we're looking at the law, any sexual penetration of a child, the penalty is life imprisonment because it's considered a very serious offense. Because we are to protect children. And looking at that, any sexual activity, like I mentioned, the whole touching, that our peers will do, any sexual act, including making them look at porn, including making them touch your private parts for your sexual gratification, etc., the penalty is 5 to 10 years imprisonment. Something I like to do, particularly, we expose children to sexual content, to porn. Some people do it. And some people, as I mentioned, a child in Sexual Offences Act is anyone under the age of 18. So when you're in school, or if you have your big shot of friend or your big brother sending you porn under the age of 18, it is considered a sexual violation. Because if you didn't ask for it, particularly being under the age of 18, even if you're above the age of consent, don't do it. You're still a child. A person is not guilty of this for the purpose of education. So some people actually challenge me about that. Because sometimes when I do sessions in schools, I would show a vagina, I would show a penis, I would like really go into, and I don't like to do the diagrams. I do the actual pictures and graphics. And some people would be like, I want my children learning that because that's sexual content. I'm like,
Right.
in the case of sexual education, no, you can't show children, you can't show them porn. Obviously, you can't show them certain sexual acts and positions, but you can show them sexual organs, like the actual pictures of it. That's quite fine. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Part of sexual abuse against children is grooming. We often, and this was actually something big, I think 2 or 3 years ago, it was all over social media about teachers grooming students. So it's like you're not having sex with them, you are not exposing them to sex, but you are grooming them into, say, like a sort of inappropriate relationship. See that, when
Right.
you reach a certain age, I like
Right.
you, I like
As
you.
soon as you graduate.
Hmm. So as soon
Right.
as you graduate, and it's very key to see that students or former students of teachers are in relationships with teachers as soon as they graduate or turn 18 or so, because you have to ask yourself what was their relationship like before they came out as an actual relationship.
True.
What conversations did they have? So it is a crime. Any person over the age of 18 who has met or communicated with a person under the age of consent, their intent to have sexual relations or intimacy with them when it's legal to do so. Any person who does that, the penalty is $1 million in a fine and or imprisonment for 5 to 10 years. So grooming is considered a major sexual offense. So a lot of people think that they could get away with it because they didn't do anything, but yes, you did do
Right.
something. Going on to abusing a position of trust, which we talked on already. A person over the age of 18 who sexually entices a child, even if they're above the age of consent, mind you, that has placed their trust into them due to their influence or position. We're looking at religious leaders, we're looking at teachers, we're looking at community leaders. If you entice a child, you're basically abusing your position of trust. So the law is added to other penalties such as rape, assault, etc., but this is also inclusive of incest. For example, babysitters.
Right.
Babysitters are your cousin, mind you. Sometimes your cousin or your second cousin, they're the ones who babysit you. It also covers that. This crime carries a penalty of life imprisonment if the child was penetrated, but if they were not penetrated, it carries $1 million and up to 5 to 10 years in prison. And looking, I just talked on incest because incest is actually
I
very,
think Chris has
very.
something to say here.
I didn't want Jared to go too far off and be lagging behind. So I just wanted to add to what he said as it relates to arranging and facilitating the commission of child sex offense. Like he
Right.
did say, police it is illegal rather to show children sexual material or have them engage in a particular manner. I think something that usually now we don't consider that okay, innocent person, right? You make an arrangement for a child to engage in a particular manner or a vulnerable person or person and engage whenever you facilitate them to have sexual activity or sexual sexual intercourse, then you are also liable. Or section 21 covers that aspect. However, it tells us that the sake of the person something along that line does not isn't seen as law as active. So, like Jeremy said, when he's doing his presentation, in school groups or whatever, in those circumstances, we don't see him falling liable under Section 21 as a reason of facilitating the commission of a sexual offense or posing a child to some sort of sexual offense. Section 19 also he spoke about composition of trust. And I think it's Section 19 that speaks also on that. It's very large, but it's we're also told by the law that in considering composition of trust, we must consider a relationship that might have existed before. So, for example, a pastor who conducts counseling and guidance with members of his church, he is considered to be in a position of trust. Members of the church responsibility in a particular manner. However, if it had been somebody who he would have been having sexual relations with prior to entering into that position of trust, then he would not be seen as liable because the law tells us, or I shouldn't say he would not be seen as excessively liable, but the circumstances in which they would have known each other prior is also considered in determining guilt. So evidence that they would have met before, they would have been talking, they would have been engaging in sexual activity before, and it just happens that she becomes a member in sex group in which she is responsible for cheering, then those circumstances are also considered.
Okay. Um,
Um, I see there's a question here that I was going to address at the end of the presentation, but might as well jump in, if I can, Nia, from Saeed
sure.
Hamid. So do you think there's a correlation between a lack of sexuality education and the cultivation? Definitely, definitely. I can tell you of personal instances where I'm in schools doing a presentation similar to this, talking about sexual offenses and abuse. And then at the end of a session, a little girl would come to me crying and say exactly what you described is happening to me. And I'm being sexually abused all this time and didn't know it. And the many cases of sexuality education or comparative sexuality education not only educates us young people on what really these offenses are and what we can do about it, it empowers us to do something about it. And many times in society we don't, because we don't know what we can do about it. And that's why we have sessions like these where we're actually going through the Sexual Offences Act. This is a form of sexual education. And not only the sexuality education would help young people about their rights, their sexual rights, but it's sort of the persons who are abusing them, as long as they know that they're receiving an education on this and they're empowered to do something about this, they would have to back off. They would, and many times they would actually be aware of what they're doing is wrong, because in their minds they don't think what they're doing. Sometimes some people don't think what they're doing is wrong or could be penalized. I talk about that early in the presentation when I talk about societal and power dynamics with gender,
Right.
because society would empower people to be like, oh, I can do this. The Sexual Offences Act, learning about it and learning about your sexual rights, would say, no, this is not right, and I'm going to do something about it. And then when you do that, you can empower an entire school, you can empower an entire community to stand up against sexual offenses and abuse. We need that since we are in nursery school. We need sexuality education from that level in nursery school to teach young children that if anyone touches you a certain way, or if anyone asks you to touch them a certain way, that is not right. Don't let it happen.
Right.
In nursery school, you
And
can have that
it happens,
conversation.
I can say that it happens in some schools. As much as it's not a part of the curriculum per se, you have some teachers that do take it upon themselves to ensure that the children are aware of when they're being violated. So my mom, she's a nursery school teacher, and I noticed that sometimes she would tell the children, come tell teacher if somebody's touching you inappropriately. So it's something that we have to, make mandatory, because you won't always have teachers that go out of their way to do certain things. And it could be anybody else in a position of trust, or somebody that has the authority, or they're interacting with children on a daily basis, that they're supposed make it something that they're supposed to do, and not just something that they can do or they want to do out of their own will.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with that. So, education is power. We did talk about,
Right.
people in your household. I just want to make mention that the Sexual Offences Act, again, very updated and progressive. It considers that incest is not only with your blood relatives. It could be with your step parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, your half siblings, your foster and adopted parents, foster and adopted relatives. All of their are considered, if they have sex with any family member of that sort, it is incest. It is. So, and this actually came up in the US just a year ago. Was it Woody Allen? I can't remember. Some actor basically married or has a relationship with his stepdaughter, and it was just totally gross. But there were no laws to really capture how gross that was. But in Guyana, it is considered incest. So just want to make mention of that. And a lot of people would ask, what's the difference between molestation and rape. I'm sorry, Nia look froze. Are you on the am I on the call?
I
Oh
think
yeah,
that
yeah.
was my internet there.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
The difference between molestation and actual rape. Now, the example I made when a schoolboy or a schoolgirl, and listen, this happens many times in the clubs and anywhere we go to. It was actually a big thing that we brought up in a nightclub in Georgetown a few years ago. If you're walking in a club or you're in your classroom or you're in any social environment and someone touches you, like just holds on your breasts or touches your butt, and for a guy, they just grab or they grab your loins, that is molestation. You have been sexually molested. That's the difference between assault and molestation and rape. So remember, rape is penetration with any bodily part or object into the mouth, anus, vagina of another person. That's rape. Molestation is just touching or any acts that involve sexual stimulation of the body. Um, Going into the big one now, rape. Now, rape is actually split into two. One of them would be stranger rape. We often know this is the back alley rape. If someone's walking, someone holds on to them, drags them in a room or something, it's a stranger who held on to their victim. Violence, anger, especially power expressed sexually in the attack of that victim. And it does involve the penetration of bodily openings, especially without care for that person. But most time rape is actually committed by someone you know. And that is why I want to consider marital rape. Now, sexual penetration perpetrated by one spouse on the other. And then considering that you're in a long term committed relationship without sexual consent. Now, a lot of people, particularly in rural areas like in the indigenous regions and even coastal rural areas like Berbice, they don't consider that a man can rape his wife, or they don't even consider that being in
Right.
a common law relationship you can rape, because they're like, we're not married, so we're in a common law relationship. No, the Sexual Offences Act simply says as long as you're in a long-term committed relationship, you can rape someone if that your partner did not give consent. And I want to make that expressively clear. Date or acquaintance rape. Now, that's not necessarily violent. I like to call this the Bill Cosby rape. Is if you did basically put in a date rape drug into someone's drink. You're in a club or you're brand, sometimes we like doing these little house limes. You go by your friend. Hey, let me just mix you a drink. If you put anything in that drink to knock someone out and you have sex with them, it is date rape. It is. And it's often by, as I mentioned, someone that you know in a trusted social relationship.
Yeah.
So I do tell people that you got to know your friends, but sometimes your friends surprise you. Just, don't put yourself in any position that I like to do something where you message someone. If you're going by someone that, like your friend, just say, hey, I'm going by this person, just let's keep in contact. Because you don't know what's going to happen. That's the reality of the situation. You don't know what's going to happen.
Right. I have this thing that I unconsciously do in terms of being accountable for where I am and who I'm with at all times. It's something that I might have been forced to do when I was a bit younger, because every time I go somewhere, my parents say, "Let me know where you're going or who you're going with." So now that I'm 18, it's something that's so deeply rooted in me that I even do it excessively sometimes, that my parents would ask me why I'm telling them this. But it's something that I think everybody should try to practice doing. At least let one person or two persons know where you're going, who you're going with, and always try to have them be able to contact you. Give them your number or the number of the person that you're supposed to be with if it has to go that far. It's not really about trusting the person that you're going with, but just, acknowledging the fact that people can surprise you.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually, to
We
add
don't
to what
want
Jared
to. Yeah.
Go ahead,
just
Chris.
said, yeah, to add to what Jared was just saying as it relates to date picking, it's considered a preparation. substance with intent. Is being labeled imprisonment for 5 years. And if it's some conviction that to the High Court before a jury, then it's imprisonment for 10 years.
Interesting. Ah, oh wow. This is really a lot. This act is relatively deep. Gyro, let's move on.
All right. Um, so just know that rape is a serious offense, and anything that I describe above that look like rape, if found guilty, it's you can be arrested for life. Not arrested, but imprisoned for life. Usually, sentencing though that I've seen in the media would be around 15 years. Um, just to know that there are certain things that we don't consider to be assault or violations of our sexual rights, but they are, and they've been spelled out in the Sexual Offences Act. It's exposing your genitals to someone who did not ask your consent. So display your naked body or parts in an effort to shock, intimidate, or sexually arouse a victim. That offense carries a penalty of $500,000 and imprisonment of up to 2 to 5 years. Also, Chris mentioned this earlier, voyeurism. So that's invasion of a person's privacy, either secretly or openly, with the intent of gaining sexual gratification. That's basically you're peeping at somebody, or if you're one of these IT whiz and you turn on someone else's camera, looking at them dressing or taking off their clothes. As long as you're peeping, it's a penalty of $500,000, fine, and an imprisonment of up to 2 to 5 years. And Chris did mention this earlier when we talk about consent and vulnerable adults. Now, sexual abuse against vulnerable adults. That's obtaining sexual activity with a person with a mental disorder, as we talk about, by inducement, threat, or deception. Because obviously we're in a caretaking position, and we could either threaten them to say you got to do this, or you deceive them into doing it. It's still a very bad thing to do. Causing a person with a mental disorder to watch a sexual act by inducement, threat, or deception. And care workers who engage or causing or enticing sexual activity with a person with a mental disorder. Something I want to mention with engagement is that the Sexual Offences Act considers that you can be guilty by being a third party. So if I were to ask Chris to do something to someone that violates any of these laws that I mentioned, although I didn't do it, Chris did it, but although I fed it to Chris to do, I am also liable to these crimes. So the Sexual Offences Act specifically defined that you can be guilty by a third party. And there's also preparatory offenses, like you administer a substance with intent. So take in mind, these are offenses you do. You didn't actually commit the offense, but you prepared to do it. That is if you administer the substance, like the date rape drug, with the intent to rape someone. If you commit the offense with the So if you commit another offense with the offense to commit a sexual offense, for example, if you break and enter someone's house to rape them, you can be guilty of the intent to do it, because although your crime was breaking an entry, you can be charged with the intent of raping someone if that's what they found that you went in to do. So trespassing with the intent to commit a sexual offense, and something I particularly love about the Sexual Offences Act, again, I'm going to say very progressive, very updated, very beautiful piece of legislature, is that offenses committed outside of Guyana are still considered in the Guyanese court. So even though if you raped or abused or offended someone outside of Guyana and the person reported it in Guyana and you're in Guyana, you will be charged in Guyana, you will be tried in Guyana as if you've done it in Guyana, even though you didn't. So I particularly love that piece of law there, that offenses outside of Guyana are still considered. Obscene phone calls, invasion of the person's privacy with sexually suggestive messages. So oftentimes, if we call someone and I've personally had this happen to me. Somebody, it's a wrong number, and someone would be like, "Hey, like your voice, like, what you doing? I really want it, You sound like you
That's so
sexy. Why are you
weird.
doing? It's just odd, and that is a sexual offense. It's an obscene
I'd
phone
be
call.
highly uncomfortable.
Very much so. If you can imagine how blocked. Sadistic sexual abuse. The sexual abuse in which the offender incites or tries to incite reactions of dread, horror, or pain. Some people really like that reaction of horror or disgust when it comes to these things. Again, consent needs to be given. You can't just do anything you want, even if the person say yes, I want to have sex with you. You can't just do anything you want with that, including making them feel afraid or grossed out about something for your own sexual attraction. And that includes chatting, which is you playing with feces without the person's consent, and also urinating on the person without their consent. Also using a knife against the person's skin just to make them fearful of what you're going to do. If you like that negative reaction you get, it's a sexual offense. The person did not consent for that to happen. That includes any physical restraint, like tying someone up with their consent, quasi religious rituals, or use of animals or inserting foreign objects into the person. So if you think a sex toy, you want to use a sex toy on someone to get them all heightened up, if that person did not give consent, you cannot do it. And I want to mention particularly sexual exploitation. We did talk about this earlier, Nia, with what's going on with the Latina migrants.
Right.
Um, I need to I will say it again for the people who are now in the call. Um, we often do not know the situation or position of why they're strippers in those clubs or why they're doing what they do. It's not necessarily by consent, but by ways of means that they can be harmed if they do not commit these acts. And that's why ever so often we see that the police would the trafficking in persons unit would go and do a bust, go into these clubs and rescue, so to speak, these women because they're not there by their consent. They don't want to do these things, but they have to because they're forced to. Their passports are taken away from them. If they want to eat, if they don't want to be, if they want to be protected, they are forced to do these acts. So it's a very sad situation that we should not forget or we should not neglect. We like to make jokes about the strip clubs and stuff, but you do not know why they're there. It's actually illegal for them to be there in the first place. And I want to mention something about sexual harassment. And this is something I take particularly personally for me to explain. So we started this conversation talking about the inequalities of gender and even societal powers that encourages persons to take advantage of persons they perceive to be vulnerable or weaker than they are. So the use of gender and status and the power differences to intimidate or control a victim or to require sexual involvement, that is what sexual harassment is. And perfect example would be in the place of work, where someone who has a position of power at work would basically use their position of power to threaten or intimidate or even promise someone that, oh, I'm going to get you X, Y, and Z. I'm going to get you a promotion. I'm going to get you anything you want if you have sex with me. That is sexual harassment. And it may exhibit itself as any of the forms I just described above, but it really is to control a person with one's own power and influence. And we see it a lot examples in campaign trails, and we see it a lot in examples of colleagues even. All right. Moving on, these particular pieces, these what I'm going to explain to you, they're not mentioned in the Sexual Offences Act, but that does not mean they're not sexual offenses. And I see Anthony Glasgow is commenting. I don't know, Nia, if you want me to jump in at this point as I wrap up, or if you want me to go to the
Uh,
end.
you can go ahead.
Okay, so Anthony is saying Guyana has the most progressive sexual offences act. That's true. Forward thinking, yeah. Use of language in the sexual offences act is generally very direct and intentional. And Dennis, that's something that we were talking about earlier with Chris when we were talking about the black and white of consent and certain things that may be up for review. I'm not going to use interpretation. Well, yes, laws can be interpreted. So review and interpretation by the law. The thing is about this piece of legislation is that it tries its very hardest to be very direct, including defining consent. Even things that are not very clear, like what constitutes a mental disorder. We had a legal mind comment earlier on that. It basically said anyone who is incapacitated or not very clear minded to give consent. That's what the
Right.
law interprets as mental disorder. Um, So if you notice in Jared's presence, he's very natural terminology as he acts to all persons opposed. Yeah. So the act is very gender neutral. It does not assume a man can be the only perpetrator of violence or a woman can
Right.
only be the victim. It says that basically anyone at any age can be the perpetrator, the witness, or the victim of sexual offenses. Siobhan is saying women don't report rape because of fear of violence, men don't report kill because of fear of shame, and that's very much true. And we did talk about that because societal pressure and societal inequalities. So women don't report rape because of fear of violence. That's true because society makes it seem as if they report rape, they're wrong. They look for it. They deserve it. They walked
Right.
into it. Is that they put their position to get raped. And as for a man, society again kicks in and say that you can't be raped. You're a man. How you were you raped? Police would literally, as a state actor in society, would shame a man for reporting rape. So sexual offenses happen because of the vulnerabilities of someone and the inequalities between genders and society, the power dynamics. And we need to always remember that, particularly people in positions of power. They don't think that they could sexually harass or assault someone, particularly sexual rights activists, as myself included. Oh, well, I can't sexually harass someone because I know the law. I know not. No, I'm in a position of power. I have certain societal position that I need to be very mindful of things I say, things I would do, particularly with comfort. And that's why,
Right.
particularly, I would always, and my friends know me, I'm a very intimate person with my friends. I'm essentially a nudist. Like, if I'm in a close thing with my friends, I would strip in a room. But I would
Ah.
make sure that my friends are comfortable. We went to a camp just 1 month ago, and I literally had to ask them. I'm like, so I'm just gonna tell you guys that I'm comfortable doing this. Are you okay with it? You see, that's me asking them if they're okay with it. And if I know I joke around, I make certain jokes with certain friends. My friends would have to basically tell me that they're comfortable with it. The second they're not, I have to, you know, step back. So that's why it's very important to know about those inequalities that we have and the vulnerabilities of certain persons. Now, wrapping up my presentation, I talked about comprehensive sexuality education being very important to note. So consider this a lesson on sexuality education. These are not mentioned in the Sexual Offences Act, but it's important that we consider them as sexual offenses. Bashing and discriminating against someone because they are perceived to be or they are a lesbian, they're gay, bisexual, they're trans, or they're queer. Now, oftentimes in Guyanese society, again, the varying levels of power, we harass and discriminate and violate against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans person because of their sexuality. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we all have sexual rights. We have a right to express our sexuality. We have a right to enjoy a life without discrimination and violence. You're violating someone's sexual rights and their body and their mind and their comfort by bashing them for their sexuality. And in Guyanese and Caribbean society, we do this often and we should really stop this. Even though it's not mentioned in Sexual Offences Act, it is violating someone's sexual rights. There are advocacy efforts that are ongoing to include sexual orientation and gender identity as legal grounds for discrimination because they are discriminatory acts. You are violating someone's rights.
Right.
That's
Um.
the last thing I wanted to mention before I go into what you can do if you've been assaulted or raped. But Chris, you have anything you want to jump in and say?
I
It's
wanted to add a few things. Are you guys here?
Yeah, we're hearing you.
All right, great. So I remember a couple of weeks ago, I think it's Yannick Easton. He posed a question as to how does the law address persons who are in school and they are
I is that me? Is that mine? Hello? Um, that's the same thing. Is it me? Like, can anyone hear me? Just comment something. We can't hear him. Okay. Yeah, but can you hear me, Gyro? Okay, I guess not. Oh, so you can hear me. All right. So Nia and Chris are probably off. So I'm just gonna go ahead, um, just to discuss it, not to waste your time. Oh, the host got. Oh my god! So the host got a power outage. So yeah, about that. So now into the part of if you've been sexually assaulted or raped. We mentioned the inequalities again, and it has to be kept being mentioned. But if you've been assaulted or raped, it's important that you call the police or go to a police station. However, if you're not comfortable going to the police station alone, you can contact a social worker. You could go to a rights-based organization. I see Dennis here is from Aspire Youth Network. You can go to the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association. You could go to Child Link. You could go to this SASAD Guyana, Equal Guyana. Just find an organization that works with your community or in your community so they can go into the police station with you. And I'm telling you this because many times police officers do not want to necessarily follow up with cases of rape or cases of sexual abuse. I've had many cases where officers would say that it is a lengthy process to go through because people aren't very cooperative. They don't have the capacity to do it. And also that you can't prove rape. You can't really prove it. And my response to that is it is not your job or position to tell someone or to be a court or to be a judge to say this can't be proven. It is your job to simply take that statement and, to the best of your ability, investigate. In that regard, what would help is if you take a social worker. If you have access to a social worker or if you have a lawyer, you can go ahead and take a lawyer while you go and take that report. So that police will record that report of the crime. You can request, and not only request, the police are supposed to take you to the private room, which they isolate for domestic violence cases. But you can request that private room to make your report, and an officer of the same gender. So if you are female, you can request a female officer. If you're a male, you can request the male officer to take your report. You can also request the presence of that lawyer or social worker in the room. What's very important to note is please do not clean the environment or wash yourself. So your natural instinct after you've been raped is to go and shower because you just want all of that, what happened to you, to wash off. You want physically, spiritually, mentally, you just want to wash all of that away from you. You want to clean up your environment or you run. It's very important not to do that. You should not clean up your environment or yourself because you're basically cleaning away and washing away evidence. I see a question here. Is there a time span to report these cases? And let's say it's like 18 years down the line. Can it hold up in court? So there's the sexual offenses, to my knowledge, based on my reading, does not give a timeline of when you can report cases. You can report it anytime you want. The thing is, though, 18 years down the line, I mean, at that part, evidence. Not to say that it wouldn't exist, because the thing about evidence is that you don't really need evidence to go through a court or a report. It could also be witnesses, or one of the examples I make is if you go in, someone take you into a room at a party, Or for example, the famous example we had with a nightclub in Georgetown, where there was a special room at the back. People were seeing these men take some women. In cases like that, it would be used in a court. You also have to acknowledge to hotels. Now, in a hotel, if someone take you to a hotel and end up raping you and they leave and you end up being found at the hotel, now the receptionist can testify that this person did indeed drag you into the hotel. So it's not necessarily if that is reported 18 years down the line and those witnesses come forward, the case can still go through. Now, Anthony, I had an experience where the police was not responsive to the reports given and questioned. So I do want to bring that up. Social worker myself were there. They said they didn't need the support, though she explicitly asked for the social worker to say the police officer needs to be trained better on this. So I'm going to let me look for something on that. So police investigation. The police are required to record and investigate every sexual offense report and within 3 months of the report to either bring charges or send the file to the director of public prosecutors. But here's the thing, Dennis's example, what he mentioned. Again, this is why sexuality education is important because it empowers us to act on the knowledge that we know. So, failure by the police to report, investigate, charge, or seek advice from the DPP within that 3-month period is a neglect of duty, and disciplinary charges can be brought against that police officer. So, if you know a police officer, as in the case of Dennis, did not do anything or saying that there's difficulties or they don't want the social worker there, that police can be charged for not doing their duty. All right? All right. So the magistrate's review, after that police officer would have done that, the magistrate would receive the police report and can make a decision if the case can go to trial or substantial evidence is lacking, which means the police will have to do further investigations. The perpetrator during this would have been questioned, asked to report to the station, and to lodge their travel documents, ensure that they do not leave the country while they're being investigated. As for the court procedure, if the magistrate is satisfied that the case is being brought, the perpetrator would be asked to provide a defense in the report made against them. This is to challenge the results of the police investigations and respond to the paper committal. That is the written statement of the account that the victim would have gave a testimony to. Why this is important to note is that at no point does the victim need to meet the perpetrator. When they're doing the report, it's in a closed room. In the courtroom, it goes into the magistrate's hands to hold, and the alleged perpetrator is asked now to confront the evidence and not the person. And just to note, false allegations. Any person who makes a false allegation of sexual offense is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $50,000 and imprisonment for up to 3 years. So I did mention everything about sexual offenses. I did also talk about people who, they can have people who would make false reports, but they are also liable to their crimes. So Dennis is, okay, Christopher. As it relates to closest age defense, section 14 and 15 covers that. I don't think there's a statute of limitation. However, rape is a criminal offense, and as such, proven liability requires requisite means and oftentimes you can prove based on information provided. All right. Yeah. So anybody, any questions you want to pose there before I leave the studio? Oh, well, Chris did mention that. So, I didn't mention it because the environment of why we had this presentation, and particularly what I mentioned with the COVID pandemic, forcing a lot of us to be stuck at homes with very violent persons and persons who abuse us. I didn't mention it, but it should still be mentioned that you cannot have sex with an animal simply because animals cannot give consent. It comes back to the word consent. And since animals can't give consent, how exactly are you having sex with an animal? So it is against the Sexual Offences Act, and it is a crime, and a very icky one too. No, it's been a very engaging conversation. I mean, Nia isn't here to close off, but thank you very much for engaging with me. And something I do want everyone in here to know is that you are all in a position of change. You're all in a position to be advocates, right? You are all in a position to be someone who can educate someone in these laws, educate them on their rights, and just be supportive. Oftentimes in society, we like to say that, no, this didn't happen. You're lying, or you put yourself up to that. I mean, you're not in that position to invalidate someone's experience. And I did start this conversation saying that there are times that some persons may want to disagree with me. There's some things that you don't want to believe. But the fact of the matter is, everyone has their own experiences, everyone has their own life, and you're not in a position to invalidate someone's report. If someone says something happened to them, you don't necessarily have to jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, it did, but you can encourage them to report it. You can encourage them to seek counseling. You can encourage them for psychosocial supports. And as I said, there are many, many avenues a person can do that. You are not in this alone. You are not in this alone. All right. Well, thank you everyone for engaging, and be safe out there in terms of your sexual rights. As I mentioned, domestic violence will be on the rise, particularly that we are, and Nia is back. We are in a position that
Yes.
would, really make people forced to live with their abusers. So just be on the lookout, make sure everyone's mental health is okay, and be your brother's keeper, your sister's keeper. Nia?
Ah, pity GPL had other plans for me. I'm sorry that I would have missed the latter parts of your presentation, Gyro. But I know for a fact that this was very educational. As a law student, I even learned a whole lot from you and Christopher. And it was a pleasure having you both here, for sure. Uh, Chris is calling. Yes, it was a pleasure having you both here. Um, I really hope that we can continue to do things like this. It might not be through Law Society, or it might, but I think these presentations were pretty amazing. Persons are commenting, they're clapping, they're applauding everything that you would have said, Gyro and Chris, and I think that we need to have more conversations like these. Uh, Within the schools especially, I know that a lot of the administrators, they don't like the idea of having conversations surrounding sex with students. They hate it. I can go as far as to say, but it's something that needs to be done. Uh it's the reality of what we're living in, the society that we're living in. This is the reality, this is the law, and it needs to be taught. So thanks a million, Gyro, for never disappointing. And Christopher, it was a pleasure having you and interacting with you for the first time. I know that the people appreciate it, and on behalf of the executive board for the Bishop's High School Law Society, I am extending our gratitude for this wonderful presentation. So I know we've been on here, or rather, Gyro would have been on here for uh, almost 2 hours now. So we'll call it a day. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for sticking with us, and I hope to have you guys on our future broadcasts, all our live sessions to come.
All
Uh,
right.
have a great day, guys. Remember to implement everything that you would have learned. Feel free to speak up if anyone violates you sexually or in any other way. And yes, you may have a distrust for the system, but really and truly, you need to find a way to deal with the situation and not just let it slide. Uh, okay, I've been rambling, so goodbye, everyone.
Thanks.